I can put it here, and you can let me know if it goes off, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And then I can, I have more batteries. This is just double A's. So that's like the cheapest technology you could possibly use to make copies of this. So, Aristocles means glory of the best, and that's pretty interesting because Plato is considered an idealist, maybe the first idealist, which we'll talk about when we get into Plato, right? And he is a promoter of the elite. So he's an elitist. So the Aristoi are the best, and he's the glory of the best. So he's yay for the elite. And notice an aristocracy is the power to the best, right? So that form of government where you have the best being the rulers, and he's definitely an aristocrat, both born, raised, etc., and arguing that that's the best kind of government. So it's interesting that his given name, apparently, is glory of the best, and Plato writes to the glory of the best. So his name actually indicates his philosophical position. Contrast that with Aristotle, Aristoi, telos, best design, best purpose. Telos is purpose. So you have Aristotle, who will be a student of Plato, and his philosophy is always contrasted with Plato. Plato's philosophy is idealism. Aristotle's philosophy is more of an empiricism or a materialism. And he's the one that gives us biology, zoology, botany, all these sciences that literally are kind of an encyclopedia of how everything is arranged. So his job was basically to describe the best arrangement. In a sense, his philosophy then is what his name calls him. Is this interesting? It strikes me as really interesting that these philosophers' names are actually more titles of what they are famous for doing. Does that make sense? And it's not just the Greeks that are like this. If you think of like Moses, right, or Moshe, right, that literally means to draw out in Hebrew, right? And what did Moses famously do?
Led the people through.
And led people out of Egypt, right? Or was pulled out of the river in the basket, right? So there's like lots of opportunities for Moses to be drawn out. It's also interesting to me that Ramoses, or Ramses the Great, right? Literally, Ra is one of the Egyptian gods, so in a sense, out of the mouth of Ra, right? The voice of Ra, so that's just, no explanations. If you want to go do a PhD on why this might be the case, there you go. Lots of opportunity as far as I know. Same with the other philosophers that we look at from Greece and other places. You can try to figure out what their name means in a sense of a title. So we don't think of Socrates as the first philosopher. The official, scare quotes. Did we do that here? Scare quotes. Right? The first philosopher was Thales, which is, as far as I could tell, water. Thalo. It could also mean death. I don't know. Translations are a lie. But if you try to figure out what Thales means, that's kind of interesting because he seems to be the first one to try to figure out in kind of a scientific way how the world became the world, right? And instead of saying God went, there you are, instead you've got everything is made up out of water, says Thales. and he called this the arche. An arche is, like we use an arch or archaeology or architecture, right? An arch, right? So for Thales, the arche, the basic building block of everything, is water, which the very next generation, and there, you could see that it was personal. Individuals listening to this teacher, who was also considered one of the wisest people in Greece, Thales. That is that. By the way, Miletus was a town in what is now Turkey, but it was a Greek colony at the time. But one of the 7 wisest men of Greece. I don't know who the other ones were. Supposed to have been wise. Although he's also being famous for being dumb. Because he's kind of like an airhead. He's like really smart, so he thinks about the stars and trips and falls into a well. Because he wasn't watching what was right around his feet. That kind of dumb thing. I just realized I've got the camera aimed right at my... That's pretty silly. Sorry about that. I'll put it there. Never pay attention to that. But there's an explanation for why he fell into the well. Believe it or not, there's an argument that even in broad daylight, if you got into a well that was deep enough and looked up, you would be able to see the stars, because the sides of the well would block out the sunlight. So the argument was he didn't fall into a well. He deliberately got into the well to look at the stars to see if that would work, and it doesn't. So that's kind of interesting. But there were a whole bunch of things that he was supposed to have done that were supposed to be pretty smart, that got people interested. But we went from there. You go to Anaximander, or however you want to pronounce those. I haven't looked those up to see what they all mean, but Anaximander, Anaximenes, these are also Milesians. They're following by generation. And they basically take what Thales argues, saying that everything is made out of water, and say, well, no, it's made out of air. Because air is thinner than water, and so it must be that water is made out of something itself, and what's it made out of? Air. By the way, they didn't know about oxygen, any of those other gases, right? And in fact, it was in the entrance to the modern period, really, where they started realizing there was like air pressure. Have you ever seen the painting of the experiment where they're killing the bird? What's that painting look like? The little girl's the only one who's horrified. You see that at all? Or is that too? Let's see if that's a part of it. Well, there's a bird in the jar, and they suck the air out of the jar. Is that the same painting? Oh, here's the bird. Poor bird is dying from lack of oxygen, and they're all just watching it die and think, man, what's causing that? And the poor little girl is sitting there going, but you're killing the bird. And she's the only one that's worried. Does that make sense? Whatever. Now, so they discover air pressure and stuff later. So the Greeks aren't aware of that. They know that there's air, but it's obviously invisible for them, right? But then the next generation, you end up with, I think it's, which one is it, Anaximander, I forget, argues that it's infinite, makes everything up. I think they killed him because that gave them a headache. If you've ever puzzled out the nature of the infinite, it would give you a headache too. I think the most interesting book on the infinite is Everything and More by David Foster Wallace. Just if you're interested in that sort of thing. He's also hilarious and dead. He killed himself at 40-something, so you might enjoy his writing, but don't become too much of a fan because you know it might be catchy. Is that weird? He hung himself in his garage. Can't get the car started, that's not the solution. That's, it's just not. No, he was depressed because he knew too much. David Foster Wallace. Anybody see the movie about him? They made a few years ago. Nobody did. I saw it. I bought it. But that's crazy. Okay, so these are the arcades, the initial arcades. Spelling it there. So Trump is right. This is politically based. It doesn't give you the right to respond. There's a joke from this morning. Anaximenes, arcades. So we've got water, air, and the infinite, which they don't really like because it bothered them. But we also have Heraclitus, which is the glory of Hera. And Hera, by the way, is the word for hour, where we get the word hour from, and also the goddess Hera, right, the wife of Zeus, and Zeus, of course, is like supposedly the god of everything, but Hera is his boss, because she's his wife, and wives tell their husbands what to do, right? That's why when I think about Christianity and they say that God is a male, I think, well, that obviously means that there must be a female who's much wiser than he is, you know. So that's kind of how that goes. Right? By the way, I highly recommend young males, especially, marry the smartest woman that will have you as soon as possible, and then do what she says. Give her all your money. And that's how that works, right? You will live longer, you'll be richer, you'll be happier, you know, all those. That's just statistics, that's the way that works. The odd thing is that the poor young woman will not be as happy as if she stayed single. Because she's always trying to, well, you please pick up your credits, you know, all that stuff. But you'll be living in a neater space, you know, because everything will be. It's just So, yeah, so I'm sexist. Clearly the female sex is the greater sex for lots of reasons. However, I'm old enough that if they fire me, I go, however, that's cool. So, earth, who comes up with earth? And fire. Heraclitus gives us fire. Heraclitus, glory of Hera. But the odd thing is, he argues that fire is the arche, but it seems to be a metaphor for change, because all of the famous Heraclitean quotes are about how everything flows. So you can't step into the same river twice, because the second time it's not exactly the same river, because it's changed somewhat. Right? So there are no real permanent objects. Everything keeps changing. Aristotle gets very upset with Heraclitus, because basically for Heraclitus, you can't name objects. So if I say, that's a clock, it's not really true or false, because it's not really a clock. And so Aristotle says, you can't argue with Heraclitus because he's arguing with himself. You know, so, yeah, don't. So for Aristotle, you just have to shoot Heraclitus. Bang! See, he's not himself anymore. Pantere is the Greek expression that means everything flows. So that's Heraclitus, and gives us fire. We don't really have one that says earth is the arche, although we have Democritus, who argues that everything consists of little uncuttable things that in Greek is called atom, uncuttable, right? So we get the word atom from the Greeks meaning uncuttable, which obviously means once the physicists figured out how to cut it, we should have changed the name, but they didn't. They kept it, and so atoms are actually cuttable, which is, language doesn't keep up with the science. Right? In Latin, they're instead we call them monads. So Latin's version of atom is monad, one. Right? So ones, basically. We don't use that hardly ever. But we end up with Empedocles. Empedocles argues that there's 4 basic elements: earth, air, fire, and water, which is a great name for a band. That is a band, right?
Yeah.
I think so.
Earth, air, earth, wind, and fire. Yeah, they don't have. Yeah, well, wind is air. If you like. Dan Brown, in his one book, had the evil priest basically having all these different bishops killed, right? If you've seen the movie, and they were all, being killed by earth, air, fire, water. So kind of interesting. Dan Brown, anybody? Da Vinci Code? No. Tom Hanks. In the movie. No. They saved the last guy. Oh well. Okay, so these are called the arches: earth, air, wind, and fire. No, well, earth, air, fire, water. Right? Aristotle will keep those, so that's essentially the winning argument for Aristotle, who basically defines the science for like over 1,000 years. And by the way, that also will affect medical care. So these were associated with the 4 humors, which were thought to make up a human being. So you're made up of earth, air, fire, water. And if you're ill, that means that the things are like out of kilter, out of harmony. And so they thought a way to make you healthy was to take
your vein and bleed you. The odd thinking being that if you were out of, harmony, by bleeding you, they were going to kind of bring you back into harmony. And they still did that as late as George Washington, the first president of the United States. Yes, you've heard of him? He was, riding around Mount Vernon. He came back. He probably had pneumonia. The doctor came to see him, and at the time they thought bleeding you was the best thing that the doctor could do, so they bled him. And the next day the doctor came back and he was worse. And normally you wouldn't bleed a person twice, but George Washington was a big guy. But he really wanted to do a good job for the ex-president, so they bled him again. And then the next day he died, probably of anemia. So it's kind of sad. But so even that late, they were killing people off by bleeding them to try to balance their four humors, which would have been, so one would be bile, one would be, oh gosh, I don't know what they would all be called. But if you read Shakespeare, by the way, and everybody ought to read Shakespeare if you speak English, so that you can get a good translation of the Klingon plays. Nobody gets the reference. But in any case, Shakespeare believed in that as good medical science. I think it was from Galen, who was the Roman that passed all that wisdom on. And so you have characters in the plays named Fiery Hal. Guess what's wrong with him? He's too courageous. Fire has certain characteristics. So Hal does really dumb things because he's just full of courage, right? So he's full of fire. He has too much fire in him. His friend Falstaff, however, is big, fat, my aspiration, and talks all the time, but doesn't do anything else. So he's full of wind or air, yeah. And so I remember even as they're going towards the one battle, Hal's off leading the men, and Falstaff is following along, and he says, what leads me on? Courage. What is courage? Honor. It's a mere word. I'll have none of it then, and he runs the other way, right? So that's kind of fun. Ophelia in Hamlet. Notice, what kills Ophelia? She drowns. And before she drowns, she's always crying all the time anyway. She has too much agua, water, right? Floss? Okay. Floss. Fluss, yes. Verstehe. Ich verstehe. You slip into German every once in a while. That's a good habit, actually. If you don't want to get promoted. No. I took my German test just because I was curious, and I ended up doing almost as well as in my Russian, which amazed me, which is why I figured, I might as well take my French test. Passed that one too. So I got paid for all three of them, which was pretty good. So, earth, air, fire. Aristotle adds a fifth element. I didn't do all four of them though. What's the fourth one? Cassius is a good example in Shakespeare of the fourth element, and that's earth. If you have too much earth in you, are you grumpy? And you're constipated, basically. So the kind of grumpy, constipated guy is like Cassius. Trust him. Fire was fiery Hal. It's too full of energy. 4 examples. But so when you're reading Shakespeare, think he's using these as characteristics of human psychology for Shakespeare, and a lot of others at the time, because that was really the common belief. So, but Aristotle argued that there was a fifth element. The four elements are what makes up everything here, but he also needed an element that would hold the stars in place, and so he came up with the fifth element, the quintessence, which, by the way, is a cute little red hair. No, that's Leilu. No one knows Leilu? Yeah, the fifth element. Nobody got the joke? That's terrible. How can I, you can't drive up to the basin and go multi-pass. They won't let you in if you. Sorry about the commercial.
Sorry, I forgot about the auto one.
Please. Help.
Hi.
Meneloi, trakta Saturn produciva metallacta ligura, ispero vera kasma ferrotinda, vero pergi hamas meta tutki zitandra, suk. Dopo metti macta se lo vuoi, ti tomale la vanella, Kiko hamas stato un drum, sono to, dindo stala, nella dindo, gela boom.
Good. That's
Bada boom.
big. Big bada boom.
Big. Bada big boom.
Big bada boom.
Boom.
Boom. Big bada boom in the cab here. Look.
Okay.
What is your name? You. Corbin?
Nella chitarra alla bilancia, partecipato.
That whole thing's your name, huh? Do you have a shorter name? Short.
Lilu Dallas Multipass.
Leah at Multipass, she knows Multipass. Leah Dallas, my wife, a newlywed, just met. You know how it is, bump into each other, sparks happen. Yeah, she knows it's a Multipass. Yeah, anyway, friend love.
Uncle.
So Leilu, that's the fifth element. Sorry. I don't know how you guys deal with the internet. Remember, I didn't have that until like just last year. It seemed like. So now whenever I have, oh, there it is. It's called a squirrel. But it can distract you if you don't. So, earth, air, fire, water, and the quintessence, the fifth essence, which eventually became thought of as the ether. So that's, by the way, we now have proof that the ether doesn't exist. However, they do think that the universe is bubbles. That's the newest thing. The space, empty space, is full of bubbles, quantum bubbles. So, it's not my fault. It's just, okay. All of these philosophers, and another one that I need to add in, although he's very unique, and that's Pythagoras. Pythagoras, pith means to speak out, and agora is the marketplace, so Pythagoras, someone who speaks out in the marketplace, basically, which is odd because Pythagoras is famous for having a secret organization. So that's weird. He's famous for speaking out in the marketplace. How come his students and all have a secret society? That's kind of weird. But Pythagoras He's primarily a mathematician, stole a lot of the stuff from the Egyptians, probably visited Egypt and brought the stuff back. He might have also stolen a lot of things from the Jewish traditions along the way. In fact, the one that argues that later is Josephus. Josephus was what's in English? So, Flavius, Josephus, or Josephus, was a Hebrew or Jewish philosopher, general. He was the next in line to replace King Herod when the Romans quashed the Jewish people because of their incipient rebelliousness, etc. In fact, Josephus would have been the next leader, but once the Romans came in, Vespasian beat them at the hill, which is, what's the name of the book? Aggamed. I'm having trouble remembering the last book. I can't think of it. Shoot, sorry. Old age. Megiddo. Armageddon. There you go. Sorry, I have to walk my way through. So Megiddo is the hill named Megiddo. That's where the last battle was that Josephus led against Vespasian to defend the Jews where they were coming in. And he lost. And all of his men all decided, okay, well, we're going to commit suicide. So they all drew straws. He had the smallest straw, which meant he would be the last one to make sure all the others were dead, and then kill himself. And once he did make sure all the others were dead, he thought, you know, I might as well not kill myself. And he went out instead and he hailed Vespasian as the Messiah. And so Vespasian said, good, okay, and adopted him. So Josephus was adopted by Vespasian. Hence, he took Vespasian's family name, Flavius, and Vespasian hired him to write the history of the Jews, the history of the war against Jerusalem. He also wrote the defense of Appian, which is where he argues that Pythagoras basically stole a lot of the Jewish traditions, etc. By the way, still today, as far as I understand it, the Jewish people hate Josephus because he was basically a traitor, and then translated for Vespasian when they attacked Jerusalem later. That happened later. Right? And so he was basically the one interceding to try to get them to surrender, and of course they didn't. So, he was to be the head, and he became the turncoat. So most folks don't really like him. He also has his version of the Bible that doesn't include the New Testament. And it's all, you could buy them, they're really cheap. It's called the Collected Works of Josephus. I bought a large print edition, which was a lie, because you have to use a magnifying glass to read it. But Pythagoras came up with, well, everyone knows what? The theorem.
Pythagoras theorem.
There you go. You all know that. He's famous for that. And by the way, you could see he did steal that from the Egyptians, because we now know the Egyptians had that. So that's pretty cool. But we still call it the Pythagorean theorem. But he also came up with an arche that was numbered. The idea that the basic building block of everything is 1. The abstract number 1. There's 2, of course, it's 2 of those. 3 is 3 of those, 4 is 4 of those, 5 is 5 of those, etc. Right? And then you end up with these, which would have been then the building blocks of which everything else is made. And notice the correspondence then with the others. So that's pretty cool. And the reason that those shapes are so interesting is because they're the only shapes you could make where all the sides are the same size. So they're geometrical oddities. And by the way, this persists too. For example, Copernicus, before he came up with the idea of the sun being the center, came up with an idea where all the different orbits were based on these different shapes. So you end up with an odd thing that they made models of. That's not what I wanted. I wanted the geometric shapes. Orbits. My mouse is missing. Still not. Rats. Well, if you could find it, he nested them all with the idea that the shapes nesting in one another would explain the various orbits of the various objects around Moon, Sun, planets, Mars, and so on. So Pythagoras. Pythagoras is famous for a lot of other things too, all associated with math. So the string theory, the divided string theory, which leads eventually to the octave system that we use in music. Pythagoras apparently discovered that the different string segments, when plucked, will create specific kinds of harmonies, right? Yes? No, maybe so. Anyway, it's pretty darn interesting when you look at the evolution of music. It seems like when we listen to the music associated with Aboriginal groups, what we hear is just a constant beat that can last forever with no specific order to the music. But it's very closely associated with emotion, right? And then the next evolution would be the kind of music you hear in India still today, associated especially with Ravi Shankar on the sitar. If you listen to that music, you get the right, because they're using all the 12 tones in between the octave that we have, right? So they use all of that. Makes it very difficult to have an orchestra that harmonizes. Notice they don't have traditional orchestras really. They became more Western when they did. And by the way, that music seems to have covered the entire Eurasian continent and was gradually changed by the Greeks, so that the Greek theory based on Pythagoras, which gives us the octave, and the strings literally then separated to create these kind of harmonic gaps, right? Ended up spreading And you could find out where it spread. It spread all the way out towards the Celts, but it didn't completely change the music of the Celts, which is why when you listen to the Celtic music, it has a lot of the interesting elements that you hear where they use those tones, right? And then from there on, of course, it progresses to eventually, much later, with kinds of chants that give harmonies that break up into the typical four voices: alto, bass, soprano, tenor, right, etc. I have jokes for all of those too, but I won't sing from those. So Pythagoras, pretty interesting. But they're all pre-Socratics. Which is on the left. Then you have Socrates. And Socrates is going to drastically change philosophy. And it's bad for him. How so? People hate him. He's basically considered to be an asshole by his community, probably for good reason. Think about it. So, for example, if you went to the Baptist temple on Sunday morning, where they all come together, and someone drove up in a Mercedes-Benz SUV, and you knocked on the window, didn't get arrested, right? And had a conversation with the driver and said, "You're a Christian? Yes? You believe in giving everything you have to the poor, right? Yes? So how about you give me the keys, let me have the car, and you've done a good deed for the day." What do you think would happen? That would be a problem, wouldn't it? They'd call the police, or the four burly guys that come out in the dark suits, the really long ties. What am I short? You could buy Trump ties. They're too long for me. Of course, you could always put the tape in it. It's just true. He uses tape, double stick tape on the back. You haven't seen that? It's true. Okay. That would get you in trouble, because the powers that be are those that believe in the divinities of the community. They have religions. What's a religion, by the way? Belief system. Very good. Any other requirements? I could believe in 1 + 1 = 2, 2 + 2 = 4, etc. But you wouldn't call mathematics a religion.
They believe in the immaterial in some extent.
Hindus don't do that. Yeah, Hinduism would be a religion. Right? They believe in all the gods are physical, interactive, like powers in physical world.
Or metaphysical in some way.
Yes?
Just believe in higher power.
That probably fits pretty well. William James argues that you have to believe in something that's larger than yourself. I've been working on this. And my definition of religion is, sorry, my page is really, can you see it? I argue that religion is belief in a meta-narrative. So, a belief system, you believe in a story that explains that big picture. It's kind of interesting because I think philosophies are that too. There's often been kind of an interaction between philosophy and religion. It's kind of interesting. But the original religions seem to be like Hinduism. We call them, today we call them based on the rural nature of what happened between the Christian development in Rome and the people that lived in the Pagano, the rural communities, which remain believing in the Roman religions, the traditional Roman religions. So we refer to them as pagan, Pagano, rural. But when we look at it, they're much more associated with lots of beliefs about the powers in the world that enable you to accomplish something, to get a good result, a good crop, protect the house, win in a battle. So, like the Greek gods, we have Apollo. Apollo is kind of interesting. What's this defense of Socrates called that you read last night? Maybe. The apology. Who's Apollo? Sun, snakes, reason. So what's the reason? Your defense is your reason for why you did what you did, right? So you've given apologies to people before, right? That's kind of interesting. Apollo, but literally APO means of or from, and LLO is the root word for logos, or order in Greek, right? So Apollo is like the reason for things. So Apollo can also be reason. And Apollo had a mouthpiece at the time of Socrates. It's still there. It's a big tourist site. You can go and visit it. It's actually quite built up. There's a stadium there as part of it. But there was a temple there, and inside the temple, down in the bottom, was a chamber where the priestesses would sit on a tripod, three-legged stool. Very important for some reason. Tripods were like very prized possessions. So they would sit on this tripod, which was situated right over the crack where there's all this spewing gases coming from the earth, which for the priestess that would sit on the stool would asphyxiate the priestess so that she would eventually be really, she would die if she stayed there too long, right? Right, because it's poisonous, right? The priests didn't do that. They kept the line going and kept taking the money from the guests that came in to go ask the priestess the questions. Well, Socrates has a friend named Chaerephon, I hear it, right? Who went and asked the priestess, was anyone smarter, wiser than Socrates? And the priestess sitting on the stool said, no. So Socrates gets this word and he's confused. Because why would the god Apollo, this is the voice of Apollo, say that I'm the wisest? Because I'm clearly not. So he decides to prove to the goddess that he's not the wisest by going to the wise people, bugging the heck out of them, to get them to prove that they're wiser than he is. So then he could go back to the goddess and say, hey, you said that I was the wisest, but I meant Joe Snuffy, who's way wiser than me, so, or whatever you would say to the goddess, right? But the trouble was he never found anyone who was wiser. He found Bud wiser, but I learned that from a frog. Bud wiser. You know? You don't watch Super Bowl commercials either? I'm trying to be funny. Don't relax. In any case, he was convinced that he ought to go and find a wiser person. So he went to the priests. One of the priests he goes to is Euthyphro, which is interesting because EU is the prefix that means good. Theo is God, and Phro, phronesis, analysis. So good God analysis. So Euthyphro is the name of the priest who's a God expert. You go and talk to a God expert. So that's Euthyphro. And this happens while they're in line for their various trials. And Euthyphro says he's in line, he's going to try his father for accidentally killing his slave. Killing his slave, Euthyphro's slave. Because Euthyphro's slave killed one of his father's slaves, and then the father took Euthyphro's slave, tied him up, and threw him in a ditch while they sent for the priest to find out what they should do. And they didn't pay attention because there was water in the ditch and the poor guy drowned. And so Euthyphro is charging his father with murdering his slave. And it's pretty clear that Socrates doesn't think he should do that. You know, it's just a slave. But he doesn't come out right and say that. Instead, he says, you know, I'm on trial for not being pious. Because he doesn't practice what the community seems to think is piety, right? Because he keeps asking all these questions that annoy everybody, right? So that's fun. So he says to Euthyphro, since I'm on trial for not being pious, maybe you could give me lessons, because you're an expert. So you give me lessons on how to be pious, and then at least I could go in there and say, hey, I'm a dumb old man, I'm sorry I haven't been pious, but I'm taking lessons with an expert. So you've got to give me credit for that, right? And Euthyphro, oh, of course, I'll help you. So what is piety, is the question. And by the way, all of these dialogues seem to focus on definitional questions. What is a specific definition of something? And in this case, it's piety. Euthyphro answers, doing what the gods love is what's pious. But how many gods do they have? Lots. Remember Hera and Zeus, right? Zeus, his favorite thing to do is to dress up like a swan and go out and rape somebody. Lots of images of this. It's like any painter. Oh, some of them are pretty. I don't know if any of them are safe. You get. It's really quite erotic, isn't it? I don't know what the deal is with swans. But of course, so Zeus loves to go out with all sorts of women. He also dresses up as a bull, other things, right? So and Hera, of course, she's in charge of time, Hera, order, including matrimony. Whereas matrimony is an important part of order in our chaotic world, right? So every time Zeus does something like that, he's in trouble with Hera, right? So here's the problem. Well, Hera would like you to behave, and Zeus would like you to fool around. So when you have two different gods and you're trying to be pious and doing what the gods love is what Euthyphro says you ought to do, which one do you listen to? You see the problem. So Euthyphro gets consternated. Is that a word? But in any case, he gets upset. And he doesn't know how to answer the question. So Socrates refines the question. He says, okay, so here's the problem. Do the gods love the pious because it's so pious? Or is the pious pious because the gods love it? Should I try that again? Okay, so do the gods love the pious because it's pious, it's so pious? Or is the pious pious because the gods love it? Which comes first? So in other words, if Zeus loves fooling around, is that pious? Is that a good thing to do? Or is it a good thing to do and that's why Zeus loves doing it? So imagine this situation. Jesus comes to your door. Jesus. I actually met Jesus myself personally on an Easter Sunday morning in Ontario Airport. That's the California Ontario. We were coming from a conference on how not to bore college students. And it was an early Easter Sunday morning, and we were flying back to Anchorage, and came up and we were checking in, and the TSA agent that met us to check our IDs was named Jesus. The significance. I'll never forget it. It's an older white guy, probably pronounced it Jesus, but you know, his name was Jesus. I met Jesus personally. But so, say Jesus comes to your door, light knocks, you answer the door, and hypothetically, you know it's Jesus, no doubt whatsoever. Let him in for tea, and Jesus says, sell everything you have, give the money to the poor, and come and follow me. So this is my quiz question today. Would you go with him? Or would you discuss your options or argue with him? What would you do? In this context, it seems to me like that's exactly the same kind of question that Socrates is posing Euthyphro in defining piety, because we could ask, does Jesus want you to live basically the life of poverty? Because that is the best kind of life. Or does Jesus want you to do that just because that's his favorite? And come follow him. By the way, this is the way a lot of people try to live their life. It's called imitatio Christi, imitation of Christ. And if you join a holy order, community. Not all of them require it, but most of them, as far as I know, require you to take the vow of poverty. Remember the teachers I had in grammar school? Are we done? Or do we go to 12:45? Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, momentary panic. If I go over the limit, just throw things at me or something. Get up and leave. Not huff, right? But is this good for economics? You know, I mean, my teachers took the vow of poverty and literally only had whatever the community gave them. And they didn't want much. They just basically lived together, ate together, didn't have other property whatsoever. And they're still doing that. There's not that many, of course, today, because we grew up in a very commercialized, egocentric environment where we all wanted everything. How much does it cost? I'll buy it. You know, that kind of.
Was that somewhat of the mentality of the hippie community?
Yes. The consumer, the school system has changed, you know, pretty much so. Colleges have now changed to cater to what the students want, rather than tell them, if you want this, this is what you have to do. Now instead, wow, you know, you have teachers, for example, that will say, hey, easy A, you love this class, we'll tell great jokes. Because otherwise they get no business and they're out of work. You know, that's consumer based, so it's changed the whole system. Yeah, it used to be that you had what's referred to as the bell curve. You ever heard of it? Right? So that you would have very few students actually earn an A. And then you would have some that would earn a B. Most, though the average, was C. And then, of course, you had some that earned a D and F. It's an interesting image, by the way. Notice it looks like a breast. Subliminally, you know, I would never mention it, but you know, that's. But it's all changed now. Now this is so some people argue that we've gotten rid of excellence. That's unfair. Everything's changed. It's not the same. Remember the Flynn effect. You guys are all smarter. The question is, how do we make sure you're uploading all of the stuff that we used to need to learn on your hard drive? Because otherwise you've got this incredibly fast computer with nothing to think about. So we want you to have all the information too. And it still seems the best way to get that information in there is from books. Because you're trying to read long, thought-provoking arguments, which you can't get off of a text message or a blurb on a screen that fits on a screen. And most movies tend to regurgitate the same basic plot because there's only two plots. Aristotle says there's two plots: comedy and tragedy. And Americans don't like tragedy. I have to say it that way. Tragedy. So a tragedy for Aristotle is when the hero does everything right and still gets screwed in the end. It's a classic Oedipus, all that stuff. And comedy is when the hero, and you really wouldn't even call him a hero, does everything wrong, but he still wins. It's like, no way. what's the name of the Pink Panther movies? Peter Sellers. Yeah, and he does stupid stuff. He always gets his match. You know, remember the scene where he's they're trying to assassinate him?
What the hell is that? I found it. Dangerous people looking for this thing. See someone.
Not messing around in there.
In their way.
Kin, rated PG-13 tomorrow.
You may not have seen these gentlemen before, but they have at one time or another worked for you. And needless to say, they're specialists. The best in France.
You expect them to take care of Clouseau?
No. They've been contracted to eliminate Mr. Chong.
That was Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong. Mr. Chong was recommended by Hong Kong. Gentlemen, fulfill your contract.
That's not the one. That's not the one I want. Oh well. It could have been funner than it was. Because it's like there's four guys that are trying to kill him. And they end up killing one another instead of him. So you have your quiz question. Did they kill Socrates for a good reason? They obviously thought they did. I mean, they had a vote, and the majority was close. It was like 30, how many votes? 33 or something like that. Votes. By the way, in their system, if the prosecutor loses his case, the penalty he asks for to be imposed on the defendant ends up being imposed on him. So if those three guys ended up losing, they would have had to have faced the penalty. And the penalty was? Okay, I have a good clip. This will be fun.
Socrates, the trial is over. Here's your hemlock. Ah, thank you. Well, what was the verdict? When do I get out of here? Socrates, the verdict was death. Death? You gotta be kidding me. For what? For teaching the youth wisdom. Well, I'll take it all back. Call him in here. I'll renounce everything. Let's get out of here. Let's go get some Chinese food. But Socrates, you drank the hemlock. For what? It's poisonous. It is? Since when? Didn't you know hemlock is poisonous? I do now. Look, I only know the general thing. What is truth? What is justice? I never learned details. I don't know what is poisonous and what is not poisonous. The kind of thing that irritates me about you guys. Oh, All right. I'm going to die. So what? When does this stuff take effect? 2, 3 years? 2, 3 minutes? What a lousy day this was. All right. I'm gonna live here, and I'm going to die. You know what's going to happen? You guys are gonna go out, and you'll have dinner, and you'll sit and stare at each other. I was the only one who ever talked in this whole group. It was what is truth? Socrates, what is the nature of the good? Socrates, what should I order? Socrates, what are you having? And not what did anyone ever say? Socrates, hemlock is poison.
Remember, this was filmed back in the day when people used to use LDS for, you know, getting high and stuff.
This doesn't go anywhere.
What? Make your body like rubber.
Notice the Greeks did not have rubber. Plus, you could tell this wasn't filmed the real Socrates because it's in color, and they didn't have color.
You know, I could eat 1,000 chocolate chip cookies right now.
They didn't have chocolate either, so you can tell this is clearly fake news.
I'm okay. I feel better. Must have been just a passing. Later. Come to me. Yes, Master.
I'm so used to this Miss Leary.
I've never called you kid.
Yeah, neither have I. I've just been like, oh, hey, Miss Leary.
Yeah.
I love the birds.
Still in there?
What did he say? He said, come, Mr. Tallyman, carry me banana. Daylight comes, and me want to go home.
Was this fun? Was this okay? We'll ask him, okay.
Hello.
Hello.
Rachel.
Rachel, welcome back.
Good to meet you. So I missed the first class. I was pretty sick with the flu bug. I was kind of exploring the syllabus, and I just want to make sure I have this understanding correctly. So you want us to purchase the book.
That's this one.
And these links that are attached, that's
extra things.
Okay, so they're not the required part.
Well, these I'm trying to give you like a wealth of interesting things.
Exactly.
But the book is an important part.
To get the book, and that'll be like our primary source.
Right, right.
Or our primary.
I also have, if you go to my main webpage here.
Yeah, I found that one there too.
I have a blog.
Mm-hmm.
And on the blog, I will post like notes, so like Monday. And I have YouTube where I post the videos that I am making.
Okay.
And you can look up Intro to Philosophy Lecture 1 and stuff like that. And I've got lots of variations because I posted the same name for it.
Okay.
So you could look for those too if you want to see. And that's true for later on if you miss for another reason. If you get another case of the flu or,
Oh, let's hope
you know,
not.
whatever, I'll put that up there so that
And then, so the quiz questions,
email me
we
those.
email you those.
And you can
Okay.
email me the one from last time too.
Okay, yeah, and I found Blackboard. You put the question on there. Okay, well, thank you.
So,
You're adding it?
I'm still in high school, and for football we have to like our
Oh,
grade
okay.
sheet.
I know. I understand.
All right.
So you have to win. That's the deal.
All right.
right?
Thanks.
Is that out?
Yeah. This is.
All right. Good.
Thank you.
Win one for the Gipper.
I have just a quick question. So,
Yes.
over Thanksgiving, I'll be taking the week after that off. I'm going to see family, and so I was wondering, is that going to be okay if I?
Yeah.
Okay, because I know a lot of professors have. If you miss 2 classes, it's a letter grade. So, as
That's
long as
not
I.
how you get an A. You know, I mean, with me, you get an A.
Okay, so just
Provided
as long as
you send me lots of
everything.
yeah.
Okay, so as long as I just stay on top of it, it'll be okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Actually, on the side of it is okay. You know,
I
you
just
don't have to be on.
wanted-
I'm not prejudiced that you have to be on the top.
Okay. I just wanted to check. Thank you.
So I just switched to your 212 class.
Ah.
I was in art appreciation, and I didn't feel like I was going to enjoy that class. So
Well, welcome to 212.
so I missed the first day yesterday.
Okay,
Is
so
there anything I need to worry about?
So here's my first lecture in
On YouTube?
Yeah, on YouTube.
Okay.
So you could go to my website. It's terrible. You know, you saw how I was doing. You've just been recorded standing there. Sorry about that.